بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا محمد الصادق الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Alhamdulillah, this is lesson number 23 and we are moving along quite well. And the intention, just in case you're wondering, is to finish before Ramadan. So we're not going to carry this on through Ramadan. We aim to finish it before. And I can't anticipate exactly how many more classes are left, but at this pace, we'll probably have about 35 or so total classes, inshallah. So we have looked at this story from a number of different angles from the beginning of the class. We've looked at the monomyth and the different stages found in very famous stories, legends, and myths across cultures. We've looked at the central ordeal of that monomyth in the story of Yusuf, which is his imprisonment. We've also looked at this in a chapter format. And looking at it from a chapter format, the first chapter of this story begins with Yusuf alayhi salam with his brothers, his father, his family in the lands of Canaan, of Canaan, before he was put into the well by his brothers. And the period of his being placed in the well and his being sent to Egypt is sort of an intermediate stage before chapter 2, which is his life in Egypt, in the house of Aziz and Zulaykha, where he grows up and attains full maturity, balagha ashuddahu. And in that period, as he attains his full maturity, the wife of Aziz attempts to seduce him on different occasions, and he resists that. And we know what took place. And we move then to the third chapter of his story, which is his imprisonment. And we mentioned that the ulama of Tafsir differ over the exact number of years Yusuf remained in prison. Some look at the years he remained in prison before the cupbearer was released, and the years he remained after the cupbearer was released. And they say 7 and 5 or 5 and 7. But usually 12 is the number given based on different interpretations. Now, bid'a sinin, as we mentioned last week, is more than 1 and less than 10. So that bid'a sinin would be an indeterminate period of maybe 7 years after the cupbearer was released, but who forgot to mention Yusuf to the king. Now, we have been looking into this third chapter of his imprisonment, the time he had spent with the prisoners, the da'wah he gave them, calling them to Allah, and then finally his interpretation and his advice to the cupbearer upon his release. We now come to the next part of that story when he's in prison. And the story occurs not in the prison, but outside of the prison, where the king of Egypt has a dream. And in this dream, he saw a number of images that were symbols standing for something, standing for meanings. And he was unsure about their interpretation, but was concerned. He knew that something was wrong, something was going to happen. They presaged something dangerous to the society. His advisor said, "Adaghathu ahlam," these are scattered dreams, they're a mishmash of dreams, and we don't know how to interpret them. And at that point, the cupbearer remembers Yusuf alayhi salam, and he goes to Yusuf finally upon the arrangement of the king, and we don't know those details. He goes to Yusuf and asks for the interpretation. And that's where we left off, where he addresses Yusuf as the Siddiq, the one who is truthful. And he knows he's truthful because he has an experience of his truth in the prison when he interpreted his dream, and his dream came true. He got out of prison. So now we come to the part where Yusuf offers his interpretation of the dream, and we look at what happens after that, before his release, and the investigation of the king and what came as a result. So we begin with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is mentioning the interpretation of Yusuf about the king's dream. قال تزرعون سبع سنين دأبا فما حصدتم فذروه في سنبله إلا قليلا مما تأكلون ثم يأتي من بعد ذلك سبع شداد يأكلن ما قدمتم لهن إلا قليلا مما تحصنون ثم يأتي من بعد ذلك عام فيه يغاث الناس وفيه يعصرون. This is his interpretation as well as his advice. He says, you shall sow for 7 years diligently. Let's remember the dream. The king had a dream of 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows. The skinny, lean cows were eating the 7 fat cows. And he saw 7 ears of grain, fresh ears of grain, and 7 dry ears of grain. So you have here 7 and 7. 7 cows, 7 ears of grain. Both of them have different qualities. Fat cows, lean cows. Moist, fresh grain, dry grain. So you have 14 cows and 14 ears of grain. So he says in his interpretation of this dream, you shall sow for 7 years diligently, da'aba, yani with effort and diligence. So leave what you reap in its ear, the shell, the husk, the covering, except a little which you eat. Then there shall come after that 7 years of hardship, shidad, difficulty. The shidad, the hardship, is referring to drought, obviously, which shall eat away what you prepare for them, except a little which you protect. Then there shall come after that a year in which people shall be helped with rain, and in which they shall press crops. So after hearing the dream of the king as relayed to him by the cupbearer, Yusuf alayhi salam offers him the interpretation of the dream as well as advice for how to handle this impending hardship. He could have just interpreted the dream, but that wouldn't have given the advice needed for handling the impending hardship. And this is noted by the mufassirun, such as Ibn Kathir, among others, who notes this as an example of prophetic futuwa. Futuwa is chivalry, prophetic chivalrous behavior of giving nasiha, of wishing well for people, of being ready to serve for the greater maslaha, the greater benefit of society. This is his role. He didn't criticize, attack, or rebuke the cupbearer for not remembering to mention his name to the king. We have no account of him saying, why didn't you say something? I've been here all these years and you said nothing. Just now you come to me? What's wrong with you? He said nothing of the sort. Now we saw in the previous verse that the cupbearer entered the prison to visit Yusuf, and to relay the dream and to get the interpretation so that he could do what? يَرْجِعُ إِلَى النَّاسِ, that he could go back to the people, so he could return to the people. And we mentioned that this indicates he didn't mention that this was the king's dream. This is an ishara of sorts, because he doesn't say to him directly, this is the dream of the king, please interpret it. He simply says, this is the dream, a dream, please give me the interpretation so I can go back to the people. This indicates he didn't tell him the identity of the dreamer. But does that mean that Yusuf alayhi salam had no idea who saw this dream? No. He knew exactly who saw the dream. He didn't need to be told it was the dream of the king. He knew, because Sayyidina Yusuf alayhi salam is a Nabi. And what does not come through wahi, he understands through his fatana, his deep intelligence and sagacity. Like all of the prophets, Yusuf alayhi salam has the quality of fatana, of deep intelligence. So either through revelation or through his intelligence, he knew that this was a dream seen by the king of Egypt. How do we know that? Well, he infers it. Either he receives it through wahi, or he is inferring it because who is the person visiting him with the dream? It's the cupbearer. What's his occupation? He's the cupbearer for the king. Number one. Number two, the dream of the cupbearer whilst in prison was a true dream. And Yusuf interpreted it correctly based on revelation. And the interpretation was that he would get out. He would be delivered. He would survive and would return. So he knows that he is in the company of the king and back to his old job. And lastly, notice that he interprets the dream and he gives advice for how to manage this problem to prevent a greater harm. And he tells him that certain steps should be taken. Now, here in the language, it's in the form of a khabar. He's just saying, this is what can be done. It's a khabar, but according to many of the imams of tafsir, it's actually a command. He's telling them, this is what must be done. That these steps must be taken to gather the food, save it, store it, have surplus food for the years of hardship. Who can do all of that on a grand national scale in that region except someone who has the authority to make those kinds of decisions, executive decisions? Anyone except the king? No, the king has to make these decisions. So he's inferring from all of this, if not through wahi, that this is the dream of the king. So he's giving not only the interpretation, but the advice for what the king should do to make sure that these things are done. So earlier in the tafsir class, we were talking about dream interpretation because the story begins with a dream, does it not? Yusuf alayhi salam begins this story by mentioning the dream he had to his father of seeing the 11 stars and the sun and the moon all prostrating before him. And from that we began to talk about ta'weel al-ahadith, the interpretation of talks or discourse, and the interpretation of dreams. We did a whole class just on some of the foundational matters concerning ta'bir al-ru'ya, dream interpretation. And we mentioned that what you're seeing in a dream is most often meanings in the form of images. Now, most dreams are like this, where you're seeing an image in the dream, but that image stands for a meaning that is conveyed. So if you see a lion, the lion is an animal. It is a physical entity. It is a thing. But if you see it in a dream, there's a good chance that it's not an actual lion. It stands for a meaning. What meaning? Courage, bravery, something along those lines. Because courage and bravery is a meaning. It's not a concrete physical entity you can point at and say, the bravery is sitting on the couch. The bravery is in the car. No, but in the dream, the meaning takes a physical form. Now, the majority of dreams are like this. It is sometimes the case that dreams are very literal and they're not symbolic. And we have that in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he says to the companions that he saw himself performing tawaf around the Kaaba, and he said, let's go make umrah. So that was literally making tawaf around the Kaaba, seen in the dream, and literally occurring in the world. So this is a dream that is without symbolism. So the dream that the king saw was full of symbols. There were 4 symbols. There was the lean cows, the fat cows, the dry grain, and the fresh grain in the ears. So in this dream, each object symbolizes some meaning. And he needed to know what these symbolize so that he could make sense of it. So what do these mean in dream interpretation? Now, the cow in general, according to this, is interpreted as the means of agriculture, because the cow was used for plowing the land, for turning the soil, for preparing the ground for planting the seeds. It is only by turning up the soil, by plowing it with the cows, that one can then plant the seeds for the harvest. So in this way, the 7 cows stand for 7 years of harvest, right? The fat cows, in that case, will be a symbol of 7 years of abundant harvest, lots of crops. And 7 skinny cows stand for 7 years of drought, when there's no crops growing because of the lack of water. Now, what about the grains? Now, the grains, it doesn't specify what grains they are. It says in the kernel or the shell or the husk, the ear, what covers the grain. That could be any sort of grain. But the ears of grain are symbols for food, right? Even in Egypt today, the khubz, your ordinary bread that's bought in every shop, it's called, in Egyptian slang dialect, it's called aish, which literally means life. And even in our culture, bread has certain meanings like this too. Someone's rushing to get out the door, gotta go to work, gotta make some bread, have to make some money, right? So bread, or grain in this case, stands for food. The green ears, or the fresh ears, represent food that will benefit, that will nourish. And the 7 represents the number of years. And each ear is representing a good harvest. It's fresh, it's full. And the dry ears of grain represent the grain that is stored away, kept in surplus. And the reason why it's in the grain, it's in the ear, is because by doing that, it preserves it from being spoiled. That's why it's kept within the husk or the ear. So the lean cows eating the fat cows is a symbol showing that in the 7 years of drought, the food that is stored will be consumed. And what is consumed will be the food that was saved up and put in surplus, and this is the dry grain within the ears. So Yusuf offers this interpretation, but also advice, nasiha, on how to see to the end of this so that people are secure and not suffering famine and starvation. So he gives them advice about what to do and tells them in a very emphatic way. As the ulama say, it was a khabar, an informing statement, but in the meaning of an amr, a command, telling them you must sow diligently for 7 years and save it except for a little that you eat. You should not eat it all. And then he said to take the rest and put it in surplus. So he starts off by saying, you're going to have 7 years of abundant crops. These next 7 years are going to be abundant. You have a lot of crops. So you should take the harvested grain, keep it in the ears, don't extract it. And this is how the grain will survive for many years to come. And that should be taken in surplus, except for a little that you eat. إِلَّا قَلِيلًا مِمَّا تَأْكُلُونَ. Except for a little that you eat. So what he's telling him here is, you have to make sure that the food supplies are allocated fairly, but not so much where people are eating more than they need. Because if people eat in the years of abundance more than they need, they're not going to have surplus for when they don't have crops growing. He said that these years, the 7 years of hardship, shidad, will be the drought, and that you should store them. You should store all of those grains for those 7 years of drought, except the little which you protect. The little which you protect. What is that referring to? So you have 7 years of abundant crops. He's saying, store this away except for the little that you eat. Don't eat it all. And what you store it away, you're going to deal with that in the 7 years, and you're going to consume that in the 7 years of drought, except for a little of that, which you protect. What does this mean? Some of the ulama say that this means this is the little that you'll be able to use for when you plant after rain comes again. Because in these years, there'll be so little water, crops are not going to grow, they're going to die. So after the end of a drought, If there's nothing in the ground to grow, what are you going to do? Even if rain comes, you have to have something to plant into the ground. So even what's in surplus is not being consumed entirely. He's saying take some of that as well. We call them a seed bank. You keep it in a seed bank for using when you do have rain. So he's giving them all of this advice about what to do to prepare for the drought, to see themselves through the drought and survive and recover when the rains come again. So he says, this is what you should do. Imam al-Qurtubi makes a really beautiful point here when he explains the meaning of this dream and how Sayyidina Yusuf interpreted it to the king. He said that this verse highlights to us that the prophets of Allah, every single one of them, came to their respective people to preserve the 5 core objectives, the 5 core benefits: the preservation of religion, of life, of wealth, of intellect, of lineage and family. The maqasid al-sharia, as we call it, the objectives of the sacred law. So he is sent not only to guide them to their after worldly success and survival, but also their worldly success and survival. What is in their benefit in dunya and in the akhirah, not just akhirah. So after giving him the ta'wil, the interpretation, as well as the advice, he continues and says, after the 7 years of harvesting diligently and storing that away, you'll deal with the 7 years of drought and you'll consume that grain, except for a little that you're going to use, that you're going to protect. He says, then there shall come after that a year in which people will be helped with rain, and in which they shall press crops. Now go back to the dream of the king. What did he see? 7 fat cows, 7 lean cows, 7 fresh ears of grain, and 7 dry ears of grain. Each cow stands for how many years? 1. So 7 years of abundant harvest, 7 years of drought. In the 7 years of the abundant harvest, you're taking the fresh and you're only eating a little, storing away the rest, which then becomes the dry ears of grain. That's a total of how many years? 14. But now he's saying that after that, there will come a year. This is the 15th year. After that, the 14 years, will come a year in which people will be helped with rain and in which they will press their crops. So that's a 15th year. But the dream only describes 14 years. Where in the dream is the 15th year described? What symbol in the dream describes what's going to happen in the 15th year? Nothing at all. So he went above and beyond the interpretation of the dream. He also gave advice about what to do, and he told him what's going to happen the year after this. There's nothing in the dream, no symbol in that dream that points to what's going to happen in the 15th year. So how did Yusuf ﷺ know this? Well, the ulama mention 2 possibilities, and it's a matter of perspective, really. The ulama say that it's possible that Yusuf knew this because based on observation, based on experience, empirical observation. How would the drought end? How would you know the drought has ended? If a place has a drought for many years, at what point can you say it's ended? When rainfall comes, right? However, there's something more here. He doesn't just say that, oh, rain's going to come. He says it's going to come with help. And in fact, the word he uses to refer to rain, yughathun nas. He says the rain will come to help people. One of the words for rain in Arabic is ghayth. وَيُنَزِّلُ الْغَيْثِ. Ghayth means assistance. It means help. It means rescue. One of Allah's beautiful names is Al-Mughith, the one who helps and rescues and gives aid and support. So either it's something he's observed from his intelligence that you mark the end of a drought through abundant rainfall, because the only way to recover after 7 years of drought is if there's abundant rainfall, or else if it's just a little bit of rain, you won't recover. And he knows that from observation, or it's revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah has revealed to him, this is what's going to happen in the 15th year. The rain will come abundantly, and it will help people, and they will thrive. Now, according to Qatada, one of the early Mufassirun, this is how Yusuf knew about the 15th year. It wasn't just based on observation of the patterns of droughts and what comes after a drought. It was based on revelation. Allah revealed to his heart that after these 7 years, it will rain abundantly and will help the people. And this is the most likely interpretation. It's possible that a person can know the basic patterns of nature, that usually this is what happens. But for all we know, a rain could come after a drought that floods everyone. And people aren't helped by that. They're destroyed by that. Here he's saying that the rain will come and it will help people. So that's from Revelation. So what we see here is, he says that the rain will come abundantly, which shall help people. It will be a form of ghaith, of rescue, of delivery. And he says, in that year, not only will rain come abundantly, but the people will also ya'asirun. They'll also press the crops. What is that talking about? Now, in the Tafsir literature, they say that this is referring to pressing sesame seeds and making sesame seed oil, and pressing olives and making olive oil, and pressing grapes and making wine. And that's the standard interpretation. When you press a crop, you're extracting the oil content from it or the juice from it. So in our case, it wouldn't be wine, would it? It would be grape juice if we were to press grapes. But in that time, it would be used to make wine. And if it's sesame seeds, it's sesame seed oil. If it's olives, it's olive oil. What is this telling us? It's telling us that not only will the people survive the drought, but in the year after the drought is over, the 15th year, rain will come in abundance where they not only survive, but they thrive. They thrive because you would only press crops if you have a surplus. If you don't have a surplus, if you're just coming out of a drought and you're getting rain and the crops are growing, but you're still lacking, you're not going to press the crops for wine, or in our case for grape juice, sesame seed oil, or olive oil. You're going to eat those things because you need the food. You only press when there's a surplus. So that is telling us that in the 15th year, it's not just rain where the crops go back. No, they grow back abundantly to the point where they have surplus, extra food to press. And that was the interpretation and the advice. Now, the Quran does not mention what happens after this in terms of how the cupbearer received the interpretation and how he exited the prison and made his way back to the king and all of that. It goes straight to the king speaking, right? It doesn't mention any of these other things. We understand from it that the cupbearer went back and informed the king of the interpretation, as well as the council, and the king wanted to see him, to meet him for himself. So Allah Ta'ala says in the next verse, in ayah 49, or I think this is 50, وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ ائْتُونِي بِهِ فَلَمَّا جَاءَهُ الرَّسُولُ قَالَ ارْجِعْ إِلَى رَبِّكَ فَاسْأَلْهُ مَا بَالُ النِّسْوَةِ الَّتِي قَطَّعْنَ أَيْدِيَهُنَّ إِنَّ رَبِّي بِكَيْدِهِنَّ عَلِيمٌ. The king said, bring him to me. So we don't have anything in detail between the interpretation in the prison and the king speaking, but we can fill in the blanks and figure that out. We don't need that information. The king said, bring him to me. I want to meet him. I want to see him for myself. So when the messenger came to him, to Yusuf, Yusuf said, go back to your Lord and ask him what the matter of the women who cut their hands is. Certainly my Lord is aware of their guile. So there's a gap here as well. We don't have these other details about when the messenger came and all of the conversation before that. But we fill in the blanks and understand that the king has sent the messenger to get Yusuf to come out. But Yusuf is saying, no, go back and ask your Lord about the women who cut their hands. Certainly, my Lord is aware of their guile or their trickery. So, Imam al-Razi notes something really interesting here, kind of a side latifa, a subtle point. He says that this ayah teaches us the virtue of knowledge. It teaches us the virtue of ilm. Because Yusuf's knowledge was a means of him being rescued from a worldly trial. Because of the knowledge Allah gave him, it eventually made its way to the king, and the king wanted to release him. So it actually helped him in his trial. So Imam al-Razi says, this is helping him in a worldly trial. So how can beneficial knowledge not be a means of rescuing a person from an afterworldly trial? Right? So this, the benefit of knowing things is that when you have knowledge, it's often a protection and a means of getting out of difficult situations. So clearly Yusuf alayhi salam would have wanted to get out of prison, and clearly he would have welcomed this opportunity to get out of the prison. But he said no. He said, go back to the king and ask him about the women who cut their hands. So instead of getting his belongings and getting out as fast as he could, which is what most people would have done, he wants to be exonerated. He wants to be exonerated. He's requesting the messenger to go back to the king and ask him to investigate and intervene in the matter of the women who cut their hands, to find out what was going on. Now the king wants to meet Yusuf and honor him, but Yusuf wants to get exonerated. We understand very clearly from this verse that the king did not simply want to meet him only to send him back into the prison. He wanted him to come out. But Yusuf did not want to come out until he was exonerated from the charge that he had attempted to seduce Zulaykha. He wanted to be exonerated. And that was the most intelligent thing to do in that situation, for a number of reasons. Despite the difficulty of being in prison for 12 or so years, instead of jumping at the occasion to get out, he decides to wait until he's exonerated before he leaves, so that he leaves with respect and honor and his name is cleared. Why does he do this? The ulama of Tafsir mention a number of reasons or wisdoms why he would want to do that. And number one, they say his role is a Nabi. He is a prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, conveying a divine message. So because of this, he is keen that no one associates with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala any of the misconduct unjustly ascribed to him. Right? What this means is he did not simply want to be personally vindicated and declared innocent just for his own sake. It is for the sake of conveying this divine message given to him. So in order for that to happen, people have to know that this is an absolutely false charge, so that they can be more receptive to what he is saying in his da'wah, calling them to Allah Ta'ala. Number two, had he been released without being declared innocent and exonerated, there's a chance that the king might still harbor suspicions about him. And if he's harboring suspicions about him, he's not going to take him as a close confidant or make him this trusted minister with such responsibility. Right? Number three, if a person of great intelligence, such as Yusuf, remains in prison for upwards to 12 years, and when given the chance to get out, refuses until an investigation is conducted, all of that is a huge qarina, as we say in Arabic, a huge circumstantial proof that he is innocent. Because if someone was really guilty, they would rush to get out. They would not ask for people to testify who were witness to certain events if they were actually guilty. They wouldn't want to have anything to do with these witnesses. They would deny these witnesses and they would get out at any opportunity. So the fact that he remains is a strong qarina, a strong circumstantial proof that he is innocent of this charge. And by asking the king to investigate the story, he wants to make sure that he gets exonerated so that no one could ever try to use that incident against him as he is in a position of leadership or authority. No one will have the ability to blackmail him. No one will have anything to hold over his head to get him to do their bidding. They won't be able to use it against him. There are people who have different scandals and they get blackmailed because they are in positions of authority. So they have to pay money or do this or that or pull strings for people, because if they don't, they're going to be outed as, being with so-and-so on the Learjet at the island where all sorts of funny business was going on and the photos will leak. They hold that over people's heads. So if he wasn't declared absolutely innocent and free of these charges, someone might try to use that incident against him in a smear campaign or to try to tarnish his image in the society. So he wanted to make sure that he's completely exonerated from these false charges. There's some subtleties here. If you pay very close attention to the way he puts this, when the messenger comes to Yusuf and tells him that the king wants him to come back, and he says, go back to your Lord and ask him what was the matter, the issue with the women who cut their hands. Pay very close attention to the language. What does he say to the messenger? He says, فَاسْأَلْهُ, ask him, ask the king about the women. This is very intelligent in dealing with kings and leaders. He didn't say to the messenger, tell the king he needs to go investigate this matter. He didn't put it forth as a demand. He put it forth as a gentle request to simply inquire. And this is wise when dealing with kings who can be very temperamental and moody and who don't like to be told what to do by anyone. They're the king. Kings can be fickle like that. And which is another interesting point, because if a king is fickle, meaning they can quickly change their minds about anything, here the king is saying, let him out. He's saying no. Any other person might think, I better take this opportunity now before the king changes his mind, or he gets busy, or is preoccupied from this matter. But Yusuf ﷺ is operating on a different level because he is receiving the divine wisdom from Allah Ta'ala. Now also pay attention to the question. He says, ask him, مَا بَالُ النِّسْوَةِ الَّتِي قَطَعْنَ أَيْدِيَهُنَّ. What is the matter with the women? What was the issue with the women who cut their hands? Notice something here. He doesn't mention Zulaykha and he doesn't mention Aziz. He mentions the women. He doesn't mention the actual perpetrator, the source of all of this drama, Zulaykha, or the one who called the shots in getting him put in prison, according to one interpretation, Aziz. So he says, ask the women. And the kaid of the women he refers to as well. He says, my Lord is all knowing of the kaid, the plot of the plotters, of the betrayers. And their kaid was desiring him for themselves or encouraging him to go along with Zulaykha's wishes. So they also had some minor involvement there. Now, their guile, their trickery was not anywhere near as bad as the guile and trickery of Zulaykha. Her kaid, her plotting was much worse than the plotting of these women who plotted in the moment. So it really begs the question, why in this situation does he tell the messenger to ask the king to inquire about the women who cut their hands? Why doesn't he say directly, ask the king, what is the issue with Zulaykha, the wife of Aziz? or Aziz. And the ulama of Tafsir give a number of different angles of interpretation for why he said this. And they say that, number one, the main desire for Yusuf alayhi salam in this moment is to be exonerated. That's his objective. His objective is not to shame Zulaykha in the situation or to embarrass Aziz. It is merely to be exonerated so that everyone knows that he had nothing to do with any ill conduct towards anyone. That's his main desire. Number two, the women who cut their hands still had some distance from the plotting. You know, Zulaykha called them in, invited them, and gave them each some fruit and a knife, and brought Yusuf in deliberately so they would see him, and they cut their hands. And they made their suggestion, told him to listen to her, but their involvement was very minimal. There's some distance there. Whereas Zulaykha has history with Yusuf alayhi salam. He grew up as a young child, and 7 years, 8 years, give or take, from the moment he arrived. He's growing up in the household of Zulaykha. She knows him very well. So there's a history there. And number two, or number three, depending on how you look at this, for the reasons why he asked about the women, is because he wanted the king to hear their story before word got out and Zulaykha could go to them and have them cook up a story. This is one interpretation. Some ulama reason that in this moment, because Zulaykha is still among the families in the circles of power, the news of this could have gotten to her. And he wanted to make sure the king addresses these women before addressing Zulaykha, so that Zulaykha doesn't get wind of anything, and so that she doesn't go back to them and have them cook up a story. Right? That's police investigations 101. You separate the suspects and you question them individually. You don't let them cook up a story. In Rogers Rangers manual, the Rangers in the War of Independence in the early years of America, one of the rules they say, once you capture the enemy, you separate them so they can't cook up a story. They literally say that in the manual. So that's a classic technique. So, because we will see in the tafsir, in the ayah coming after this, that when he speaks about these matters, the king, Zulaykha is in the audience. So there's some proximity to power here. So it's also possible that when Yusuf says to the king, or regarding the king, that he should ask the women, that included among the women is Zulaykha. Because after all, when he questions them, we hear Zulaykha responding. So in your mind's eye, you may picture a king having an audience of people, and there are the women who cut their hands, and Zulaykha is among them because of her proximity to power and her involvement in it. This was in her house. It was at her doing, at her invitation, so there's involvement with her. So Yusuf wants the king to ask the women about what happened because they witnessed his behavior, Yusuf's behavior in response to Zulaykha. They witnessed his behavior in response to them, and the women witnessed Zulaykha swear an oath that if he doesn't respond to her in her attempted seduction, she will have him imprisoned. So if the king hears this from these witnesses, these women, yes, Zulaykha did this, yes, she attempted that, and she admitted that she did what she did, and she swore an oath that if he doesn't respond now, she's going to have him imprisoned, that would prove that he is absolutely innocent of all of these charges. So talking to them is very important. Now the next question is, why doesn't he mention Aziz? Why doesn't Yusuf say, ask Aziz what happened when he came to the door and they investigated the shirt? Some of the ulama of tafsir say the reason why is because at this time, this is some 12 or so years after, the Aziz has died. There are some narrations which mention that he has died by this time, and Zulaykha is a widow. And Yusuf would have known that through revelation, or he would have known that through news reaching the prison. Allah knows best. But he didn't mention the Aziz. And notice also that when he puts forth this request to the messenger, he says, ask the king what is the issue with the women who cut their hands. He doesn't actually mention what they did. He doesn't say, go and ask the women who did ABC, 1, 2, 3, XYZ, so on and so forth. He puts it in this very ambiguous way. Think about it this way. Imagine someone comes to you and says, go and talk to so-and-so who on the day of March 11th, 2020 at 9:55 p.m. in so-and-so USA did this ABC 1, 2, 3. And you fill in all the details. They know everything now. You've told them everything. And compare your curiosity then to your curiosity if someone says, go talk to so-and-so and ask them what happened on March of 2020. And you leave it very ambiguous. You've piqued their interest now. They want to find out, well, what's going on? What's happened? So this was a way of piquing the interest of the king to find out what the women know, what's going on with them, and to question them. And so we go into the next verse, and it doesn't mention how they gathered them there, but it mentions him addressing these women. Allah Ta'ala mentions, قَالَ مَا خَطَبُكُنَّ إِذْ رَاوَدْتُنَّ يُوسُفَ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ قُلْنَا حَاشَا لِلَّهِ مَا عَلِمْنَا عَلَيْهِ مِنْ سُوءٍ قالت امرأة العزيز الآن حصحص الحق أنا راودته عن نفسه وإنه لمن الصادقين. The king said, what was your matter when you tried to seduce Yusuf? They said, حاشا لله, exalted is Allah, we knew of no evil on him. The wife of Aziz said, now the truth has become manifest. I tried to seduce him, and he is surely of the truthful ones. The messenger goes to the prison. Yusuf does not agree to come out of the prison until he's exonerated. He tells the messenger to ask the king for the king to ask the women about what happened when they cut their hands. The king calls them forth, and listen to what he says. What was your matter when you tried to seduce Yusuf? Now, Yusuf is still in prison. We have to remember that. As your imagination is filling in the details, understand that Yusuf is still sitting in prison as the king is having this conversation with the women. And he says, what is the matter? What was your matter when you tried to seduce Yusuf? Notice he doesn't say, what was your matter when you cut your hands? What does that tell us? It tells us that the king either had prior knowledge of the incident or the details were given to him before he called these women forward. So he might have known beforehand through the rumors that traveled through the corridors of power, or during this time after the message was delivered to him, he asked different people and they found out the backstory, what was being said. In this case, the king asked his intelligence apparatus, and they gave him an intelligence debriefing about what happened, and then he calls them forth and asks them. So by saying, what was the matter with you when you tried to seduce Yusuf, there is an implicit acknowledgement that they did try to seduce him, and he has prior knowledge about this. All right? It could be argued, and some ulama mentioned this, it could be argued that Yusuf filled the messenger with the details, filled him in with the details about what those women did, and then that messenger then conveyed to the king. However the king found out, we see clearly that he's speaking to them not as women who simply cut their hands, but as women who had involvement in attempting to seduce Yusuf. And here we get into some very tricky territory when we try to interpret this verse and the verse that comes after it, because we're faced with the issue of pronouns and who is asking whom and who is responding about whom and in what context. Because remember, we have Yusuf in prison, we have Zulaykha, we have Aziz, we have the women, and we have different angles of conversation going on. So we have to piece it together in a very careful way. What is the nature of the questioning here? When the king is saying, what was your matter when you tried to seduce Yusuf? Why is he asking it in that way? Right? Some of the ulama say that what this means is the king is asking the women, what happened when you tried to seduce Yusuf? In other words, how did Yusuf respond when you tried to seduce him? This is one way we can interpret this question. And their response is, Hasha lillah, exalted is Allah, we know of no evil on him. And this would mean Yusuf has committed no evil. So according to this understanding, the king is asking about what Yusuf did in response to their attempted seduction. And they say what? They say he did not commit any immoral act whatsoever. This is one angle of interpretation based on the intention of the king's question to the women. But we can also read it in a slightly different manner and say that the king is asking the women what they did, not about what Yusuf did. So he's saying, why did you do that? Not how did Yusuf respond to your action when you tried to seduce him. So clearly, we see from this wording that the king is treating the attempted seduction as a fact, not as something under question. Did it happen? Did it not happen? And so he's saying either how did Yusuf respond when you did that, or why did you do that? Never did he question if the attempted seduction happened or not. That was a given. So he's asking them what they did. What's the story behind their action? And if you read it in that way, it changes how you understand their response. If they're asking about, if the king is asking them, the women, about what Yusuf did, what does their answer mean? Their answer is, Hasha lillah, exalted is Allah, Yusuf didn't do anything wrong. That's how you understand their response. But if you understand the king's question as him asking them why they attempted to seduce him and not asking about his response, their reply takes on a completely different meaning. Instead, it means when they say, Hasha lillah, we knew of no evil on him, it means we didn't have anything to do with seducing Yusuf. So they're exonerating themselves. They're saying we had nothing to do with this. And when they say that we don't know of any evil coming to Yusuf, they're meaning that he has not faced any evil as a result of anything we've done. He didn't go to jail because of us. It was because of someone else. So here they're exonerating themselves. And this interpretation is very strong because the king is not questioning whether the attempted seduction took place or not. It is to be assumed that he believes Yusuf's innocence based on all of the circumstantial evidence. So he's not trying to find out how did Yusuf respond. Did he succumb or not? This wasn't really a question for him. He wants to know why they did that. And their response, instead of admitting to what they do, they said, Hasha lillah, as if to say, we didn't do anything. And whatever came to Yusuf of evil, it wasn't from us. It wasn't from us. That was from someone else. So in this case, they are exonerating themselves and even exonerating Yusuf in a way. Right? Yusuf's still in jail during this conversation, remember? And as the king is having this conversation, remember, Zulaykha is also there. We don't know the circumstances, how she got there. Was she told to come along with them? Did she manage to gain access to the king's private quarters to be a part of this conversation? We don't know. But after the king questioned these women and they said this, it was now confession time. It was now confession time for Zulaykha. And, she's made to know about this, or she's brought into this conversation. And the women exonerate themselves, according to the second interpretation, which I go with. It makes the most sense for me, at least. They exonerate themselves, and they say that we don't know of any evil to come upon Yusuf because of our actions. We don't have any responsibility. They exonerate themselves, and in a way they exonerate Yusuf. And now comes Zulaykha. It's her time to confess. The women declare themselves innocent, even though they're not. Yusuf is seen as innocent, and he is. It only leaves one more person because Aziz has died, and that's Zulaykha. So Zulaykha steps forward at this stage, and she admits to what she did. And she says, Al-ana hasal haq. She says, now the truth has been made manifest. Hasa in Arabic means ittadaha wa tabayyana wa istaqarra. It means it's become clear and evident and settled. The matter is now settled and fixed. There's no way out of this now. Right? Think about it. She's a widow. She doesn't have a husband anymore. Aziz has died. And the word on the street is that she tried to seduce her servant. And she's known for this. That's her reputation. This is weighing heavily on her, even though she's denied it. So now she comes clean and says, I tried to seduce him, and surely he is of the truthful ones. So she admits to it. In the next ayah, we get to either a statement of Yusuf or a continuation of Zulaykha's discourse. There's a difference of opinion about who is saying this in the next ayah, who's speaking. In the next ayah, Allah Ta'ala says, ذَلِكَ لِيَعْلَمَ أَنِّي لَمْ أَخُنْهُ بِالْغَيْبِ وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَهْدِي كَيْدَ الْخَائِنِينَ. That is so he knows that I have not betrayed him in his absence, and because Allah does not guide the scheme of the betrayers. We mentioned a couple of times before about the importance of the idmar, the pronouns in Arabic when it comes to tafsir. You have to identify who is speaking, to whom, about what, or about whom. And when Allah uses the pronouns here, we have to figure out who's speaking and about whom. That is so he. Who is he? That is so he knows. Who? Who knows? That I have not betrayed him. Who is him? Is it the same as the first one, or is it someone else? So there's some complexity here when we want to unpack the possible meanings of the verse. Don't worry. It sounds like it's going in multiple directions, but we tie the loose ends when we explore the possibilities. So who is saying this, first of all? There's only two possibilities. Either it is Yusuf alayhi salam speaking, or it is Zulaykha. If it's Yusuf speaking, it begs the question, the conversation that was just had, where Zulaykha admits to having attempted to seduce him, was in front of the king. Where is Yusuf in that moment? He's in jail. So if he's saying this, there's a very sudden shift, a sudden iltifat. And this means either the news reached Yusuf and he sent a message to convey this meaning, or it means this is what Yusuf said sometime after he was exonerated and released from the prison and gained an audience before the king. So between the statement of Zulaykha and this statement, if Yusuf said it, a lot of things transpired that are not mentioned. So you have to fill in those details, if Yusuf said it. Now, if Yusuf is the one saying this, and this is the majority view, by the way, the majority view of the Mufassirun is that Yusuf is the one saying this. If he's saying this, he's not physically present when the women spoke, so this was conveyed to him and this is his message, or it's something he said when he got out. And what is he saying then? So, according to Ibn Abbas and Ata, among others of the early Mufassirun, he said this after he got out and he was in the presence of the king. And what he's saying is, ذَلِكَ لِيَعْلَمَ, that is referring to telling the messenger to go back to the king to ask him to inquire from the women who cut their hands. And the reason why I put that request forward is so that he knows, the king knows, that I did not betray the king in his absence. Because it is said that to betray the minister is the same thing as betraying the king. And to betray the minister, in this case Aziz, would be to betray the king. This is one way it's interpreted. So here Yusuf, according to this interpretation, he comes out of the prison and he's standing before the king and he's saying to him, the reason why I told the messenger to go back and I didn't come out of the prison and I told him to go back and have you ask those women is so you could find out the truth and know my innocence and know that I did not betray him, speaking to him in the royal third person in his absence. Because to betray the minister, Aziz, is the same thing as betraying the king himself. Because the minister is a representative of the king. Right? That is one interpretation. It could also be said that he's speaking to the king and saying that I did what I did so that Aziz would know that I didn't betray him. But that assumes that Aziz is still alive. And there's no clear-cut, ironclad, 100% authentic proof that he was dead or alive. These are just some narrations. And yuqal, it is said, and people take it at face value and go with it. But if he was alive, then it would mean also, or possibly, he's saying so that Aziz knows I didn't betray him. But that seems to be a less likely interpretation because the Aziz saw all of these proofs and realized something was afoot. And then when he says, and Allah does not guide the scheme of the betrayers, according to this interpretation that Yusuf is speaking, it means if I had betrayed the king, if I had betrayed the king, I wouldn't have been removed from prison. None of this would have happened. Right? But Aziz saw the signs of innocence and did not suspect him, or he died. And so the likely scenario is that it was the king he was speaking to here in the third person. Right? And all of this is based on the Tafsir saying that it is Yusuf speaking here. But there is a possibility that it's Zulaykha speaking. And if we take the ayah to be Zulaykha speaking in the company of the king, it takes on a different meaning. So if you say that Zulaykha is speaking here, she confessed to what she did. Al-ana has al-haq. Now the truth has been made clear. I attempted to seduce him, and indeed he, Yusuf, is one of the truthful ones. And right after that she says, and that is so he knows that I did not betray him in his absence, and Allah does not guide the scheme of the betrayers. If she's the one speaking, we have to look at the sentence from a completely different light. It would mean, ذَلِكَ لِيَعْلَمَ, that is so he knows. What is that? My confession. The reason why I am confessing, or my confession, is so that he knows. Who is he? Well, it's Aziz if he's alive. And if he's not alive, Yusuf alayhi salam. So that Yusuf knows I didn't betray him in his absence. What does that mean? It would mean that I am confessing now that I tried to seduce him, and he is indeed from the truthful. And I make this confession now so that Yusuf knows I did not betray him now in his absence because he's in prison. Because he didn't do it. I'm not going to say I'm innocent so that the women exonerate themselves and I exonerate myself and Yusuf remains stuck in prison. That would be a betrayal after all of this. I'm not going to betray him in this moment. I'm going to speak the truth so he can get out. That's if Zulaykha is speaking. And if she's speaking here, the betrayal is regarding in the absence, saying that so that he knows I didn't betray him in his absence. It would refer to Yusuf most likely and not the Aziz. Because even if Aziz was alive in this moment, the attempted seduction is a form of betrayal. No one in their right mind would say that it's only betrayal if the actual seduction succeeds and not the attempted seduction. Any husband in his right mind would consider an attempted seduction as much as a betrayal as a full seduction. It's obvious. And if we say that Aziz is dead, it only leaves one possibility. This is Yusuf alayhi salam. So now we have the truth coming out in this moment. We have a very vivid scene depicted in the Quran about Yusuf being in jail, refusing to get out until he's exonerated, the message being delivered, the king inquiring from the women speaking, Zulaykha now confessing, and this is all that leads up to the release of Yusuf alayhi salam and the beginning of the 4th chapter of his story when he ascends to power and authority in the land of Egypt. So inshallah, we're going to stop here, but we have a little bit more in the 3rd part of the story that we're going to use as we carry it over into the 4th chapter of this story. Because in the next verse, it's also a difference of opinion about who's speaking. Some ulama say that in the next verse it's Yusuf speaking before the king, and some say Zulaykha is speaking in the next verse. And we're going to look at that verse because in it, whoever is speaking is saying, I do not exonerate myself. The women exonerated themselves. Yusuf is exonerated altogether from the charge. And here, the speaker, whoever it is saying, La ubarri'u nafsi, I do not exonerate myself. Inna nafsa la ammaratun bisu. And whoever is speaking here says, the soul, the nafs, the lower self, commands its owner to evil. So from there, we're going to speak about the different types of souls, how this verse is understood with other verses in our Islamic spiritual psychology, the different types of nufus, souls, and look at what that means. And from there, we transition into the 4th chapter of his story, the ascendance to power and authority in the lands of Egypt. Wallahu rasuluhu a'lam, wa sallallahu wa sallam ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Any questions? Kal'ada.
So, 2 things. How do we know that Zulaykha actually stepped up herself to admit it at that time? And it's not like the crowd turned onto her. It's almost like everybody knows, right? So, was it peer pressure or like the moment where it's like the spotlight is on her? How do we know that was definitive where she just stepped up because she didn't want to hold that burden anymore? And then number 2, what's the dominant opinion on who spoke in this ayah, this last ayah, and why the idmar? Why this ambiguity where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't just say in these ayahs all waqalat or waqala Yusuf? Why?
So that's about 3 or 4 questions. So your first question, it really speaks to what was going on in her mind at the time. And it's difficult to say with any authority what ultimately caused her to say that. I mean, Allah Ta'ala calls her to say that in the big picture, right? We know that according to the narration that her husband Aziz has died, that she's now a widow for some 10, 12 years. And there's already rumors going on in society. 12 years have passed. Maybe people have forgotten, but those women haven't forgotten. And she wants to get this off her chest. She's growing older. When she's at this age, she's realized that she can't continue like this anymore and keeping up the facade, keeping up the lie. So whether it's due to external pressure or internal pressure, or the combination of the internal pressure and feelings of guilt combined with the external pressure of the women speaking, she said, "Al-ana hasas al-haq," and that's the extent of our knowledge about the matter. The second question was about the speaker. In which verse are you talking about?
The one after "Al-ana hasas al-haq," so the
ذَلِكَ لِيَعْلَمَ أَنِّي لَمْ أَخُنْهُ بِالْغَيْبِ.
why isn't it just explicit? Qala Yusuf.
Okay, so yeah, so your second question is actually the same as your third, because the question is
Why
idmar.
the idmar?
Why the ambiguity?
Right.
So the question is it ambiguous? Yes, it is. Are there multiple possible interpretations that can be made about it? Yes. Which means it leads us to the conclusion that the ambiguity is absolutely purposeful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if He wished to identify the speaker, He could have clearly said, qalat, she said. And no one would be discussing if Yusuf spoke or she spoke, because we would know she spoke and not Yusuf. So the question is, why the ambiguity? Well, we know that it's done for a reason, that there's a purpose behind it. And the ulama have explored this. If you look in the science of Quranic hermeneutics or ulum al-Quran, in the sciences of Tafsir, there's a chapter on idmar, and it goes into the linguistic aspects of idmar, and it also looks at some of the wisdoms behind the idmar, the reason for that. The ulama describe the Quran in a lot of ways, and one of the ways they describe it as bahrun la sahila lahu, a shoreless ocean. You think of an ocean, you think of a shore line going around it. But this is an ocean without a shore. And they also say, لا تنقضي عجائبه, its marvels are unceasing and unending, which means that the more you contemplate it, the more you can extract meanings. And a part of that process of tadabbur, of reflecting on the Quran, is reflecting on the different possible meanings that are determined based on who is speaking and about whom and what. When you have ambiguity, it can go this way or it can go that way, and each one offers you different lessons, right? So if it's Yusuf speaking, we fill in the blanks of the message reaching him. Why would he say that? Why was it important for him to be exonerated? He explains now. Because a prophet is one who conveys. They engage in tabligh al-risala, conveying the message. The very opposite of that is khiyana, is betraying the trust given to them by Allah Ta'ala and doing things that are unlawful. So he wants to be exonerated, and so that people know he did not engage in the act of betrayal, because his mission as a prophet is tabligh, it is conveyance, it is not concealing. He is the most upright person morally. He is not a person of betrayal. So that's the angle. If it's Zulaykha speaking, she's coming to terms with what she's done. She's feeling guilty about it. Her desire for Yusuf has now calmed after the years. She's come to terms with it. And she's feeling guilty for having put him through so much hardship. And in this very critical moment, she could have pretended that he was still the guilty party and he would have stayed in prison. Or she could have come clean and done right by Yusuf so that he comes out of prison. So you have these two different streams that are offered based on the ambiguity within the idmar. Now, obviously, there's a question of tafsir too. You have the position of of Ibn Abbas and Ata and others who say that, well, this is Yusuf speaking. And if they say Yusuf is speaking, there's some authority to that. It has some weight. But unless there's something absolutely explicit within the Quran that clarifies the speaker as Zulaykha or Yusuf, or if there's something in the Sunnah clarifying explicitly that it's Zulaykha or Yusuf, we have an ambiguity that allows us to explore two different interpretations, even if we may lean to one more than the other, based on other pieces of the puzzle. And it just gives you different ways of further reflecting on the meanings of the Quran. And this is beautiful. And one of the things that the ulama teach, many of the ulama, they say, as you explore the idmar of the Quran, the pronouns and the use of pronouns, you also look at the usage of words that are descriptors of the Prophet ﷺ. And you see certain meanings come out when you read verses that are on the surface speaking about something, but you can read them as speaking about the Prophet ﷺ. This is also another angle of tadabbur. For example, I'll end the answer with this one. In Surah Al-A'raf, Allah Ta'ala mentions, إِنَّ رَحْمَةَ اللَّهِ قَرِيبٌ مِنَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. So for the students of Arabic, this verse is saying, the rahmah of Allah is close, near to those who are good doers. For the students of Arabic, you'll notice that rahmah is a feminine noun. And in Arabic, if a noun is feminine, the adjective describing it has to also be feminine. So why does Allah Ta'ala say that the rahmah, a feminine noun, is qareebun, close to the good doers? Qareebun is a masculine noun. Why doesn't it say inna rahmatallahi qareebatun min al-mu'minin? And there's a lot of different answers in the Arabic language. Ibn Hisham al-Ansari, he has a whole risala, a whole essay exploring all the different ways you could explain that just from grammar. Many of them are weak arguments, but hey, there are views that have been explored. But the conclusion that's by far the easiest conclusion to make is that the rahmah here is referring to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Inna rahmatullahi qareebun min al-muhsinin. The people who are good doers, people of ihsan, they have a certain closeness and proximity of connection and love to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he is given the title Rahmatullah, the mercy of Allah Ta'ala. وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. We have only sent you as a rahmah for all of the worlds. So he is the Rahmatullah ila al-alamin. So you can read the verse in that way. And that's not even a pronoun. That's just a case of rahmah and the ambiguity given the masculine noun qareeb as an adjective for rahmah. And there's other verses where you can do that too. But that's a part of the exploration of the meanings of the Quran and contemplation, what we call tadabbur. Allah says in the Quran, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ أَمْ عَلَى قُلُوبٍ أَقْفَالُهَا. Do they not contemplate deeply on the Quran, or are their hearts locked up? So when the person is engaging in this practice of reflecting on all of these possible meanings, they're doing tadabbur, and that action is a sign that the heart is actually becoming more opened. Because the opposite, the inability or unwillingness to do that, is a sign that the heart is more closed or locked up. So it's kind of a reverse engineer, right? If the heart feels locked up, one of the ways of unlocking it is to reflect on the Quran, right? And it's one of the signs that the heart is more open, because you're having more openness and receptivity to the various meanings of the divine kalam, the kalam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wallahu a'lam.
And this is the dominant opinion. What's the dominant opinion for that ayah? It's Zulaykha?
Yusuf. Yeah, Yusuf.
Now, if Zulaykha, if the assumption is Zulaykha, could we say this is like, almost like an apology and almost like istighfar to Rabbil Alameen for what she's done?
Yeah, I don't know about the istighfar part. I mean, there's narrations that say that she attained iman, but yeah, definitely an apology or doing right by Yusuf in a moment where it really counted, right? Coming to terms with what she did in the past. Yeah. خير. الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد.